there's a lot to unpack with it, so that'll be fun. Hello, everybody, for today's World Hoppers video. This is kind of an extension of the Stormlight Archive discussions we've been having. So we've been chatting through Wind and Truth, and as I think a lot of people have in talking about their thoughts with this, various different criticisms have come up, and Sanderson actually addressed some of these things. And so we thought we would just make a quick little video going through what he said and then also our thoughts on some of these things. So I'm going to read through this. It'll be on the screen in case I'm reading it pretty quick, but this is the gist of it. It says that the criticism is that Brandon needs to be edited more, which this particular user, it says, mentioned this with a very helpfully constructive tone, and it's an idea I see popping up elsewhere. I assure you, I'm edited now more than I ever have been, so I don't believe editing isn't the issue some people are having. Tress and Sunlit Man, for example, were written not long ago and are both quite tight as a narrative. Both were edited less than Stormlight 5. Writing speed isn't the problem either, as the fastest I've ever been required to write was during the Gathering Storm Way of Kings era, and those are books that are generally, by comparison, not talked about the same way as, say, Rhythm of War. The issue is story scope expansion. Stormlight in particular has a lot going on. I can see some people wishing for the tighter narratives of the first two books, but there are things I can do with this kind of story I couldn't do with those. I like a variety, and this is the story I want to tell here despite being capable of doing it other ways. Every scene was one I wanted in the book, and sometimes I like to do different things for different readers. I got the same complaints about the way I did the bridge for individual viewpoints in Oathbringer, for example. There were a lot of suggestions. I cut them during editorial and early reads, and I refused, not because there is no validity to these ideas, but because this was the story I legitimately wanted to tell. That said, we did lose, I'm not sure how to pronounce this editor's name, Mosh, but they did lose them. Mosh, you said?
Mosh, yeah.
Okay. They lost them largely, and he was excellent at line editing in particular. I see a complaint about Wind and Truth having more than average, quote, show than tell moments, which is my term for when you repeat the idea too many times, not for reinforcement, but to write your way into concept and do it weekly as you're discovering it. So your subconscious has you do it again a few paragraphs or pages later and do it well, then you forget to cut the first one. And this is something I'll have to look at. Plus, I feel that we have been rushed as a team ever since Gathering Storm. That's a long time to be in semi-crisis mode and getting books ready the last few months before publication. We largely as a company do a good job of avoiding crunch time for everyone, except a little bit during the year, depending on the department. The convention, for example, is going to be stressful for the events time, while Christmas for the shipping team. And I don't know that Peter or I could ever not stress and overwork a little at the lead up to a book turn-in. However, part of the reason I wanted to slow things down a little is to give everyone a little more time and hopefully less stress. So I can't completely discount all of these comments out of hand, and I do appreciate the conversation. So that's where we're going to be chatting through. There's a lot more in this in reference to the state of Sanderson. So this is the only snippet for today that we're going to be addressing. But first, I just thought it would be good to ask the group here today, did you at some point feel like Sanderson was less edited? Is that something that you assumed or you took to be true because of a lot of people have this idea that when an author becomes more successful, the time isn't taken to edit their work. So I'm just curious if any of you found yourself thinking that that was a possibility at some point.
I didn't really assume less edited per se. I just kind of thought of it as he is given more freedom to write the story he wants to write.
Which he does say here that he's trying to write the story he wants to tell.
Yeah. I felt like it was more creative freedom as opposed to less editing.
I think that makes sense. Sarah, is that what you thought?
I definitely picked up on something in this book that I hadn't really thought of before or noticed in previous releases from him. I think some of the language is a little bit more modern than I'm used to seeing in the Cosmere. Some of he mentions show not tell. I definitely think there are certain things that he tells instead of shows, which I think he has normally been good at doing, showing rather than telling. So definitely something about the editing, I think, has felt off, or it hasn't felt as polished as previous books from him. to me.
And you actually looked before this
Yeah.
came out at the editing and the acknowledgments and saw
Yeah.
that this editor wasn't there any longer. So you thought that was maybe what it was. Sounds like that is at least a part, because it's acknowledged there too that
Mhm.
they didn't have the same editors necessarily. Sophia, what are your thoughts? Just kind
Yeah,
of
I think
first impressions.
Moshe retired quite a while ago now. I think it's been a few books from Sando without him being part of the editing process. I can't remember exactly when, but I remember him talking about it in live shows that he's done before. I have never had a problem with Sanderson's writing, and I know that that is a problem and has been a problem for some people. Like always, it's never been a problem for me, and I can't say that I felt any differently about the writing in this book than in any of his others. So it's not something I've really thought about, to be honest.
Christy, what do you think?
I feel like I'm quite the opposite to Sophia, because this book specifically stood out to me most about things in his writing that I didn't love, but I never felt in his other books. And I don't know if it's because, I'm coming into reading this right after having read some of the Dandelion Dynasty, which has some of the best writing that I have ever read. And to go from that to Sanderson, it's just like such a huge shift. I don't know if it's because of that, or I'm just like, my tastes are changing as a reader, but this book had so many writing issues that I was like, it's stopping me from appreciating and loving the book as much as I want to. And part of that is the show, that he's telling instead of showing, which, like I thought of. This is something I noticed even before his comment, especially in this book when it talks about the characters' emotional states and how they're feeling in their mental health and their journeys. It's a lot of like telling us how the characters are feeling and be like, oh, this person feels this way, but they're also this way and blah, 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 which it's kind of taking me out of the story rather than just like showing us where they are. And I also have very, very kind of nitpicky grammar choices too, because I'm only reading it physically. I'm not listening to the audio at all. And there are so many em dashes and ellipses and words that are italicized for emphasis.
I think that something that gets noted about those sorts of things, the bells and whistles, is it does stand out to the eye to have that. And I think that it's going to be up to the individual as to what crosses the line into being excessive or starting to feel almost like text exchanges. And I think people have noted that things feel more modern, like Sarah, you were noting it. I don't know that it all comes down to word choice. I think some of it could be this element as well being reflected in the writing. I will say, going back, having reread Mistborn a couple times, it's present more than maybe you might remember the amount of, and I will add, because you, Christy, mentioned having, you just read another series and you're coming to this, that there are certain fantasy authors that I think take on almost like a more formal feeling. I think Robin Hobb, that's true of Robin Hobb as well. And I think also there is a question of the style matching what we're going for. And with Stormlight being so complex, and he talks about this in the him addressing the criticism as well, with it being so complex, there is a level of wanting to keep it inviting as well. And because there's so much emphasis on mental health and how the characters are feeling, I think there's almost like trying to have the writing match how human beings sort of process and think, hence the, the ellipses or the way that em dashes will be utilized as a way of sort of like you have a thought and then an extension of that thought. However, I do think that there is a certain line that while it moves for each person, there's like a general spot that a lot of people consider to be a little excessive. And maybe we are leaning into that, generally speaking, as well. I think for me, tying back into the tone aspect of things, I don't know so much if I feel like some of what he's addressing, like Bridge 4, getting their own perspectives earlier in the series and things like that. That's not maybe what I would point to. We have talked about this a little bit in our conversations about the various days of Wind and Truth so far. But for me, the tonal shift is more so what I think I'm noting as feeling different. And I think maybe that's what he's describing as certain books like The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance were tight narratively. But to me, I don't know if I feel like Wind and Truth isn't tight. I feel like it feels like it is not as mature in a sense to some of what we got. And we talked a lot about like the grit of what Kaladin experienced in Bridge 4 and in Way of Kings. And I don't know that I feel like that grit is necessarily where we have landed here in Wind and Truth. This is feeling a little bit more like it leans, I would say, a little bit more toward Marvel, whereas I don't know if I had ever thought that necessarily. I mean, people use the Marvel comparison in like comparing Cosmere to Marvel. So not in that sense, but I just mean tone wise, I don't think I would have described Way of Kings as that. Way of Kings to me felt a little bit more serious and intense. And this one is intense in its level of stakes and its scope, like he said, but I don't know if I feel that the Bridge 4 thing, I'm sure people told him that. And I should add, I can't imagine being so successful to a point where, and so inviting to your readers and having this connection like he does and this openness that you then are kind of saying, oh yeah, the criticism, let me actually look at the criticism and then let me go ahead and tell you where I feel like, okay, let me explain certain things, but also add like, yeah, I think there's some legitimacy to this here. Most authors do not do that. So I feel we're in an interesting situation where we can like almost criticize his addressing of the criticism, if that makes sense, which isn't, I don't think, the goal for any of us here. It's just kind of an interesting conversation. But I am curious because, Sophia, you said that you don't feel like the writing has necessarily changed for you much, but do you feel like maybe the tone has changed a little bit across the series?
I do, but I also think that, for me at least, it's necessary in this one because I have been stressed about Wind and Truth since I finished reading Rhythm of War. So how long is that? Like 2 years, 3 years? So I've been stressed about it. And when I was reading it, I was stressed reading it. So I can't imagine how much more stressful it would have been if that slightly lighter tone wasn't occasionally there as well. I feel like it just, for me personally, would have been too much if it was, say, as somber as The Way of Kings was. I mean, even it took me, ironically enough, 10 days to read the book, and that, it doesn't sound slow, but that's actually reasonably slow for me. And it's because I did have to keep giving myself breaks because I was just getting so like anxious about what was going to happen. I just can't imagine how much more difficult I would have found it to read the book if there wasn't those moments of levity. Also, it helps that I actually find Sanderson's humorous, which I know is not the case for everybody. It works for me, so that certainly helps, I'm sure. But yeah, I think I needed it to have that slightly lighter tone in the places that it does, just to relax me a little bit.
I think that's fair, and that's what's so difficult about there being people having criticisms of a series, is what doesn't work for some people works really well, and you're not going to please everybody, and that's something I think a lot of authors have to accept, and I think he has, and I'm really glad that he is writing the story he wants to tell. I think for myself, I am a little bit in opposition to that feeling you were describing of like, I need some of these jokes in here. Like, I find certain things funny, but I don't think I find the same things or as many of the things funny that he has put in here. And I don't recall, I will admit I'm picky when it comes to the level of campiness juxtaposed to the level of intensity and depth. And there are certain stories that meet it perfect for me, and other stories that those moments take away from the serious moments for me. A poorly timed joke or the certain kinds of jokes that are made, it's hard for me to be like, we're almost facing near apocalyptic stakes here within 10 days. And we need to talk about like potty humor. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of, it's not really for me. And I don't recall that being an issue early on. I feel like there was a couple of times where I'm like, oh yeah, I just didn't like love that joke. My husband kind of often talks about how he doesn't understand why everybody thinks that the boots scene is so funny. And I am like, well, yeah, everybody's going to have different takes on the different humor or moments of humor here. But it just feels like tonally it's not what I was delivered. And I think going back to where I'm maybe in opposition to you, Sophia, is like those intense feelings that we have when we're reading, and that the fear, I want that. I want if you can establish that, the more you can establish, the more like rewarding character, whatever heroic thing happens or whatever tragic thing happens, I feel like I feel it that much more when you've made me care so immensely to the point of like I'm stressed out. Like I really like that feeling throughout. And I think that's why, to go back to Way of Kings, because I'm kind of mirroring beginning to end of the series, the intensity of what has transpired within Way of Kings and the tragedy of it, and then to see where it ends up, like even just describing it to people, I get emotional of the like, I don't know how many people are afraid of spoilers in this conversation. So let me say really quick, let me put a spoiler warning and then I'll take it off the screen just in case anybody, but here's a spoiler, just preparing people. The whole "we have to go back" part gets me like every single time. I get so emotional about that scene because you're like, everything they went through and they have a chance to run away now. They could take it and they choose to go back, not even knowing, one, if they would live, and two, if their sacrifice would mean anything. And then that means when Dalinar gives up his blade, that also was like gutting in the best of ways for me, like in a finally somebody did right by these people. And okay, spoiler is gone now. But like, can you imagine if in the middle of that scene, someone, I don't know, was like making a joke about like, oh, did you happen to like wet yourself in that moment? Because like, man, I heard a smell. Like I'd be like, dude, what are you doing? Why is this happening? You know, like I didn't feel like those moments happen, which I should clarify, Sophia, I'm not trying to say that that's the level that you are like, I love things like that. But I guess I'm perhaps exaggerating here for just to get the point across. I don't know that I always need the tone to be lightened. Like, let me sit in some of these harder moments for a while and let me feel that alongside the characters. And like, yeah, random stuff happens. And sometimes people just being people is funny. So like if a character, you know, ends up having a funny mannerism or reacts in a way that doesn't feel natural, that is actually a thing that people do. I just don't know that I always need to insert some of the humor that we've been getting, but I want to let other people have a chance to respond. Sarah, what are your thoughts on some of those topics?
Yeah, as far as the humor, I feel like I wouldn't mind it if there was still humor. I just feel like it was like inappropriately timed. Like some of them kind of felt like it interrupted like an important moment, and I was like, I was feeling some kind of way about that moment. I didn't need to like adjust right now to a joke, but if it was like a lighter moment where that joke maybe would have made more sense, I'm definitely on board with that. It just felt inopportunely timed for me.
You have an example, I know, but do you want to give it? I can put the spoiler warning up.
Sure.
Okay.
So it's in Wind and Truth when Maya calls Adolin a slut, or like says, "Oh, you're such a slut." And I was like really contemplating their relationship and how much they've grown together. And like, I even took out my notes to write that down, being like, wow, I can't wait to see where their relationship goes. And as I'm like taking out my notebook to write that down, Maya's like, "You're such a slut, Evelyn," and I was like, so like things like that. I was like, maybe in a different conversation that would have worked better for me, but in that specific moment, that is not what I wanted. So,
well, it's funny because it's unfortunate that Roger's not here because I brought this up to Roger and he's like, I thought that was hilarious, but that's because I call everybody a slut. And I was like, I mean, but I think part of it too is, speaking of like tone, this is less a humor thing and more to do with like why certain things feel modern. That whole passage was like, didn't you two used to date? I didn't date her. And it's like, are you a slut? And I was like, are we on TikTok? Like, it was kind of odd because I don't remember that language. And to be clear,
yeah, they used to call it courting in like the previous book.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. Because I, and again, Roger's not here to speak for himself, but I just figured I'd include because he had a somewhat different take on that part. But Roger's thing was like, I prefer slightly more modern language to like made up world building language. And I'm like, well, they can be separate things, you know, like I think people can take issue with the whole like storms, which I don't mind actually, because I feel like that's world building and established. But I don't think the use of certain words that we just described within the spoiler tag, that's not an established word that's been used in the rest of this series. So it almost borders on continuity in a sense. Like we want to make this joke at the expense of potential world building language that's been established. Because I don't care if you have a series where the whole point is you're supposed to take this fantasy setting and apply very modern language to it, then cool, I'll roll with it. I'm not upset at modern language in fantasy books. I don't like when it feels like out of nowhere a word or a way of speaking suddenly is introduced that was never there before. And the reason I don't like it is it almost, for me, goes against world building. It feels jarring. But I feel like that is, it maybe comes across nitpicky, but I feel like it's these like little things that maybe are what people are picking up on. More so, I would say, than the inclusion of Bridge 4 perspectives. But again, Sanderson has so much criticism, I'm sure, that he tries to validate his readers, which is generous of him. And he tries to take certain things and incorporate it and be the best he can be, which is an amazing thing for an author to do. But I can't imagine trying to assess the scope and the amount of certain critiques, right? So if he's hearing we should take the Bridge 4 chapters out as a critique, and then other people are saying some of the language feels more modern, it might come across like way more people are saying Bridge 4 chapters should be cut, and not that many people are talking about the language. And thus it seems like this is the criticism to say, oh, here's an example of a thing that I got that I felt like I should include. But, you know, within this section, and of course he's not going to go through and give us every single criticism that's ever been directed at him, but we didn't address the fact that it feels more modern, or we didn't address certain things. So it makes me wonder what pieces have been picked up by him and his team as like, oh, these criticisms, I see them, but maybe I'm going to push back on them a little because that's not the story I want to tell, versus other criticisms that we're not seeing him address, so we don't really know his feelings about them. I think this is why it's like a pro and a con for authors to address criticisms, because it's very commendable that he would consider what his readers have to say. But then also it opens the door, unfortunately for him, for people to be like, no, I don't care about that. I care about this, which is like almost what it feels like we're doing. But I don't want, in a weird way, it's like, I don't want Sanderson to watch this video and then decide anything, right? Because I respect, let me have my criticisms, let readers have their criticisms. I see a child waving. I respect though that he stated this, I think at least twice in this section. That's not the story I want to tell. If that's the case, if the story he wants to tell is the one that has like, we're becoming more modern in our language, or maybe like you were saying, Christy, we're going to utilize em dashes, ellipses, more italics than maybe we would have in the past, or maybe more than I would have in the first two Stormlight books. If he wants to use those things in service to the story he wants to tell, then that's what he's going to do. It just might mean that some of us aren't going to always connect with it, you know? I think that's kind of just how it goes in general. But Jesse, did you have more you wanted to add here?
I mean, I also like his humor, so I'm kind of with Sophie on that. The humor makes me laugh most of the time. There's instances where I'm like, but like usually it hits for me. But like I like Wayne, so take that as you will.
That character as an example is a good one. I think it's funny. I'm sorry.
No, you're like, I'm just a big fan of like people use humor in stressful situations to try to lighten it. Like that's what it feels like more so to me. But you're not totally wrong on the more modernization of, I guess, the language and the way that it comes across. I didn't even really pay too terribly much attention to it until like the different, and you're like, oh, I guess they did used to say courting, dating. Like I thought Maya saying that he was a slut was the funniest. That like I cracked up. Not even
spoiler.
Sorry, I thought it was hysterical. But there is that, and I do think that he tries to take. It does seem like he's trying to take some of the criticisms that he's like received in the past, but still be like, no, but this is the story I'm telling.
Which I respect.
Like, I respect that totally, and trying to find that balance, because it could go the completely opposite way, where he's like, everyone on the internet hates me, and I'm just going to completely change everything so that everybody likes me. And then like, you're never going to have everybody like you. So just stick with what you want to do.
Yeah. I think as far as addressing criticism, this is a good way to do it if you're going to do it. Less of a like, here's why all my readers are like wrong though. Here's why anybody that doesn't love me is wrong. Christy, did you have something? It looked like you had something you wanted to add.
For the modernism thing, I think he does address a little bit in one of the later, in the like with the comments if you scroll down, but it is a bit long. I don't know if you want to look at that this time too, but definitely agree with the ill-timed jokes. So sorry, spoiler banner.
Oh, let me put that up. I found the example if you want me to put it on the screen, by the way.
Spoiler banner. Okay, in Words of Radiance, the Shart Plate conversation is one of my favorite scenes in the entire Cosmere. I laughed so hard, but that worked for me because it felt like appropriate to the scene and the circumstances they were in. But whereas in Wind and Truth, some of those kinds of jokes, I'm like, I feel like it's not the most appropriate time. An example is when Sigil and Leighton, they were on the Shattered Plains and they were seeing like all this ominous stuff happening with the singers. And Leighton all of a sudden goes, I miss goobering. And Sigil was like, did you just say goobering? And he explains like what it is. I'm like, not the right time, guys. So
I agree. And I did find the passage that you were referring to. So I'll pull that up. Let me take the spoiler out because he does address.
Also, sorry, one other thing is
spoiler or non-spoiler?
Not spoiler.
Okay,
I don't disagree that, he might be being edited more now than ever, but I don't think, like, to your point, Elle, it's not the editing that we are, like, what he's thinking of editing is not what we are thinking of in editing. And the fact that he says that every scene that is included now is a scene that he wants to be in there to have the story that he wants to tell. But then I'm thinking of scenes like a certain one in Day One with certain body parts. I'm like, really? Like, this is the story you want to tell?
Yeah, I think that that's a really difficult battle every author always has to fight, is what do I need to cut and what do I need to keep? And when I am advised to cut something, when do I push back and I trust my gut? And when do I accept that, okay, maybe this would be better without this? And again, it's going to be up for debate. Everybody's going to feel differently about what should or shouldn't be cut. I do think it's interesting, though, with the idea of modern language. Let me get to this part, because somebody asks about it specifically. So then there's a response. I have noticed this criticism. I'll watch it in the future Stormlight books, but I can't say that I think Wind and Truth is much beyond my other novels. I just went back and reread the first few chapters of Elantris, and to me, they use the same conversational, modern tone in the dialogue as you see in Wind and Truth. I feel like this hasn't changed, and I've been getting these criticisms since the early days with phrases like homicidal hat trick in Era 1, Mistborn, or even okay instead of all right in Elantris. I use Tolkien's philosophy on fantasy diction even if I don't use his stylings. The dialogue is in translation done by me from the original form in the Cosmere. You don't think people back in Middle Ages said things like, just a sec? Sure, they might have had their own idioms and contractions, my bad. But if you were speaking to them in their tongue at the time, I'm convinced it would sound modern. And then he kind of gives some examples of this. The thing is, one of my biggest comparisons in fiction is George R.R. Martin, who prefers a deliberately elegant, antiquated style for his fantasy, much as Robert Jordan did and Sapkowski still does. They'll reverse clause orders to give a slightly more formal feel to the sentences. They'll drop contractions in favor of full write-outs, sometimes where it doesn't feel awkward. They'll use older versions of words and rearrange explanations to fit in uses of whom. All very subtle ways of writing to give just a hint of an older way of speaking, evoking not actual medieval writing, but more an 1800s flair in order to give it just that hint of antiquity. In this, they prefer Tolkien stylings. I do want to kind of, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This will be, obviously people can find this if they're interested. So yes, it's a stylistic choice, but within reason. If I'm consistently kicking people out of the books with it, then I'm likely still doing something wrong and perhaps should re-examine. I do often in Stormlight cut okay in favor of all right and other things to give it just a slightly more antiquated feel, but I don't go full George R.R. Martin. Perhaps the answer then is it's a mix in general. This is my stylistic choice, but I'll double check that I'm not going too far and maybe take a little more care. While I can disagree with the fans, that doesn't mean an individual is wrong for their interpretation of a piece of art. You get to decide if it's too far, and I'll decide if I should reevaluate when I hit book 6, which I really appreciate that takeaway. That said, if it helps you, remember that this is in translation by English from someone doing their best to evoke the tone of what characters are saying in their own language, and someone who perhaps sometimes errs on the side of familiarity in favor of humanization, which is interesting because that's almost exactly the things I was talking about, where I feel like some of the ways that he's writing is intended to be more like that human connection. But I also will add, I think the other side of this that I was saying, I think this is maybe what is coming across, and that's not what I'm referring to, is I disagree that there isn't a shift between early Stormlight and Stormlight now. And I don't care about it sounding medieval. I don't care about it sounding more formal. I care about it matching as it has throughout. And of course, there's a couple of, I'm sure, instances you can pull, specific examples you can pull from every one of the books he's written. It just feels as though the language is more informal in Wind and Truth and more modern than it has been in the other Stormlight books, in my opinion. But I do appreciate that he's like, readers are going to have their takes, and I'll do what I can, but I might disagree sometimes, and I'll also try to be aware of this. I feel like that's all we can ask for. But I'm curious, Sophia, you seem like you disagreed. This is something that we kind of addressed. It seemed like you disagreed with this a little bit before. Just curious if there's anything additional that you wanted to say.
No, I mean, I can't remember which of his talks. I think it might have been the release party talk at Dragonsteel, where he actually spoke about how, some people had issues with the way that he writes and it's too simplistic or whatever else that, this has been part of the conversation about Sanderson's books for as long as I've been reading them anyway. And I mean, yes, perhaps there's some more modern language, and you've pointed it out, and I agree that it's more modern. But I didn't notice it while I was reading it. I've only noticed it because you have pointed it out to me. And unlike Christy, I've got the opposite experience. So Christy, you're reading it totally physically, and I read it totally on audio, so I definitely wouldn't have noticed any of the grammar stuff, and probably that's a good thing because I'm like the grammar police and it bothers me. But then I also use a lot of dashes in my own writing when I'm writing professionally as well, so maybe it wouldn't have bothered me anyway. I don't know. I haven't read it physically, so I can't say.
Not to throw Christy under the bus, but this is a pattern, Christy, you pick up on, like you for V.E. Schwab, if she has, I kind of call it like a rule of 3. If you have like 3 words that are alone and they're their own sentences, and it's like a period between those 3 words, like 3 adjectives used to describe something. You're like, the one adjective was fine, stop using 3, you know, like that kind of thing. And something that I go against, so I'm kind of tying Sophia. I actually agree with you in certain areas, and then agree in others that for me, it's about like the rhythm of a sentence. So sometimes I like there being those additional words to describe something because I like the flow of it and how it reads, because that's like tied to language, just like the sounds that you have as you're reading it, even if you're just reading it in your head. I like that flow. And then other times though, you're like, it's every time though. So kind of it's a little excessive. And I feel like maybe that's where a lot of us are coming together with some of our feelings of criticism, is that I don't think we mind slightly more modern language, especially in service to more humanization for the characters. But when it's starting to stand out to a point where I don't think this is about whether you use okay instead of all right. This is like Christy was saying, you have like the goober thing or dating or sluts and things like that, where it's just now, I almost wonder if because he has accepted that he does tend to utilize language in this way and serve this purpose, if in accepting it, it's become something he's not as aware as, because he's like, well, I know I write this way. I know I'm not more formal like Sapkowski and George R.R. Martin, and I don't want to be, which is a good thing. But then maybe it's like it allows for things to slip through the cracks sometimes. Slip through the cracks subjectively, of course. Sarah, what do you... Oh, sorry, Sophia, go ahead.
No, I was literally just going to say, I think it's just part of his authorial voice and just his voice generally, because that, maybe not slut, but goober is something I could definitely see him just using in everyday conversation.
Yeah, and I think I'll add, I'm so sorry, Sarah, I was just about to ask you to give your thoughts, but I wanted to add really fast before I forget. Because he uses Sunlit Man as an example, Sunlit Man to me didn't feel like Stormlight. And it also is more modern. It's like way later in its events. So I guess I suspected that it would sound different. And like Era 2 sounds different from Era 1, which I thought made sense because, again, time has passed. So I thought it was like an intention to have there be a difference. Tress is more whimsical and magical and fun. And so I'm like, okay, that tone I don't expect to match. But again, I feel like Wind and Truth, being a part of Stormlight, I'm looking at it in comparison to early Stormlight books. I'm not comparing it to Tress of the Emerald Sea. I'm not even comparing it to Mistborn Era 2. They're different planets. They have a different way of advancements with technology, and language is different there. And they like literally have different magic systems, ecosystems. So I don't expect there to be the same thing. And some authors, every time you pick up a book, the authorial voice you're talking about, I think you note it immediately. You're like, this is this author. And I think V.E. Schwab is an example of someone, because I brought her up earlier, where I'm like, yeah, this is V.E. Schwab. I feel it. But other authors from book to book feel completely different depending on the story that they're telling, the stakes, and what the characters are experiencing. And for me, like, I always felt like he was trying to match the tone to the characters in a lot of ways. So I never minded Lift being kind of ridiculous and immature, because I'm like, that's matching Lift. But now I feel like the lines are blurring, where a Kaladin chapter and a Lift chapter are much more alike than they would have been in the past. And I think that's for me where, while all criticism is subjective, I think this is the area that maybe a lot of the fans are like, yeah, that's where it's at. That's what I mean when I say it doesn't sound the same anymore. Curious if maybe there's agreement or disagreement or pushback on that. Sarah, if you want to finally get the chance to chime in.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you on the tone being different from the beginning of Stormlight to the end. Like, the continuity of that not being there, like changing the words that you would use. And I also think it's the example that he used of okay and all right. I think that's kind of like, that is like actually nitpicky in my opinion. Like that is not the problem here. Like, I don't know. That was an interesting example, like for someone to tell him that, I guess.
I'll add, as somebody who enjoys writing, I will do the same thing. I'll be like, I can't have okay. It has to be all right. And it has to be all right, ALL space, and then the word right, not ALRIGHT, not one word. Because people will pick apart if you use all right in that way. So I know where he's coming from in that department, even though I'm like nothing like Sanderson. But sorry, go ahead. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I don't think it matters that much, but I understand other people care.
Yeah, like a word like that is not going to throw me out of the story, but a word like dating, when they previously used like courting, that's something that is like, oh, you haven't established that as the tone yet. Yeah, I think that's...
I think some people have pointed out therapy. I mean, when Wit says stuff, we expect him to say things that feel off-world. So that's not what we're talking about. But I think the language, some people, I do wonder, and this is like, I think this is incredibly admirable. I'm pretty sure Sanderson has sensitivity readers and people who help ensure that the language he's using in reference to mental health is not damaging, which is wonderful. And I by no means want to act as though there's anything negative about that. I think something that can occur is because we in our world, in our modern times, have certain words that we do avoid and words we do use. And as a result, it's possible that some of the word choices he's using in certain scenes, I don't know if there's one I can think of off the top of my head, but when trying to describe how characters are feeling, I think in the past, kind of leaning on, I guess spoiler, I don't really think this is a spoiler, but Kaladin being told, you know, you will feel warmth again. That's a perfect way to describe a concept that could be more modern in its execution if we wanted, but I feel like everybody knows what that means, and it's kind of artistic and beautiful, and like made me want to bawl my eyes out as somebody who's experienced that exact feeling. It's like it cuts deep because you're like, it's like Wit's telling me that, you know. And I think that maybe that could be really beneficial, is to, you don't want everything to lean into metaphor and over the top artistry for things that sometimes the rawness is what gets us. But especially with mental health and language around it, people's mental health journeys are so personal and they can be so messy. I think most people, you know, if there's point A and point B and you're trying to get to point B, nobody gets there in a straight line. We always have, we go forward, we fall, we step up, and we keep going. Again, language that he's used in the past is not the first step, it's the next one. You know, those kinds of things I think have really worked in the past in relation to the mental health. And now it's just like, it kind of feels like we've jumped a little bit ahead. Christy, did you have something to add here? And Sophia, it looks like maybe you have some thoughts as well.
This is kind of unrelated, but the only other thing that I still had in mind was back to the tonal shift between Way of Kings and Wind and Truth, is because Way of Kings, it felt so heavy, so serious, so gritty. It really, like, I could really like feel that, and it engrossed me into the story, and I was invested. And you really felt the stakes. But with how Wind and Truth is being written now, and a lot of the hee-hee-ha-ha moments and the modernization, I just feel like I can't take it as seriously. So I don't feel like that high level of stakes anymore, even though these are literally the highest stakes that have ever happened in the Cosmere. Yeah,
I think that's kind of very similar to that contrast we talked about between how Sophia feels versus maybe some other individuals. But Sophia,
it's funny because this is the only time I've felt this. So
I think it's fair, and I think that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Normally, I love Sanderson's writing and love his humor. Yeah,
I think in the past, I could point to certain series and say, this one's a little heavier, this one's a lot more fun. And now I'm wondering if we're going to get to a point where they all are fun. Like, I thought Mistborn Era 2 would be, like, oh, Mistborn Era 2 is different than the rest, because it is. But I'm like, is everything turning into Era 2? Because I don't want Wayne in a substance that permeates the rest of the Cosmere, I don't know if I want that necessarily. Sophia and then Jesse, I want to make sure you get to add final thoughts here.
I don't know that I necessarily have anything different to add. I suppose I will say some of the more humorous or modern moments have been, I think, in Adelyn's POV chapters, and we haven't had as much from him previously, so maybe that has something to do with it. I don't really know. Because I didn't notice this stuff, it's difficult for me to kind of identify if there's some sort of common thread there. What I do want to say is, in Reassurance, I think it's less of an issue later in the book.
Oh, okay. That's fair. That's fair. For anybody that doesn't know, this is being recorded right after our discussion for days 3 through 5. And some people are done with the book. I am not, because I'm only allowing myself to read up to a certain point. So that's good to know. And Sarah, I feel sorry, Jesse, I'm skipping you again. But Sarah, you have finished the book. You have finished the book. I think you have been somebody who is perhaps the most critical of the language use in Wind and Truth. So just kind of to counter Sophia. But Sophia, I do want to add, I'm glad that you are participating in this as somebody who doesn't necessarily feel exactly the same, because there are so many people that are still feeling as you feel. But sorry, Sarah, go ahead. Sodium.
I actually think I agree with that, with the second half of the book feeling better. Okay. But that also could just be because, like, I was just like, oh my God, like, what's happening? That I wasn't like paying attention to specific word choice or anything. So not that I have any plans to reread this anytime soon, but I would be curious to go back on reread and see if anything jumps out at me as much as it did in the first half.
And I'll add that in the past, because exactly what I've described about, I'm used to just reading these books and I get through them because I'm like, I'm ready. And I'm purposefully kind of taking my time so we can have these discussions. And I wonder if so many of us have waited so long and are participating in so many conversations, and the fandom is much broader reaching. Social media has connected so many of us that maybe some people like yourself, Sophia, you'd be like, I wouldn't have noticed it, but I guess that's a conversation now. So now it's in my head. And so I'm wondering if that's playing a role. I'm wondering if, because some of us are stopping and chatting and discussing, that it's kind of this feedback loop that's just going back and forth. And it's just kind of enhancing in our minds a quote unquote problem that maybe either doesn't exist or isn't as extreme as it would be if we all just read it by ourselves. I'll say I talked to my husband about stuff, and there have been a couple of times where I'm like, I don't know. I think the dated slut scene, I distinctly, I was like, I know my friends didn't like this. Without even talking, I was like, I know some of my friends didn't like this. I told Sean about it, and he was like, that's not my favorite. And then even though Roger did like it, it was still like enough of a thing that people noticed it. So I'm trying to like add legitimacy to both. Maybe the fandom has this, we're all in a circle projecting our thoughts in an echo chamber, and then maybe also there's some legitimacy as well. But Jesse, you haven't had the chance. I'm so sorry to add too much.
No, like, I don't feel like I have too much different to add. I definitely lean more towards Sophia's side. Like, it doesn't bother me. I think that's just it. It's like, it doesn't bother me. I don't even think I notice it half the time. That's the problem. Like, I'm just like, but also I am not physically reading the book. I'm pretty much solely listening to it. So I think that does make a huge difference. because I'm just sitting here listening as I'm, doing other things or as I'm, whatever. So maybe if I was physically reading it, I would notice more little things. And now I'm kind of curious, like I might pick up my physical copy and like just
it would
check
be interesting to poll people who have exclusively listened or mostly listened and their feelings about this versus people who are reading. I wonder if that would
I wonder if that changes it.
That would be interesting.
What are you doing, Ellen and Sarah?
I almost exclusively listened.
Okay.
Oh, so you're the outlier.
Yeah.
So I've been doing immersion reading with the exception of days 1 and 2, although the whole like what's in my pants scene definitely stood out to me still on listen. But I only did exclusively listening because my physical copy hadn't arrived yet. Since then, I've been doing immersion where I listen and I have, but that's mostly because, okay, look, I've only had the ability to tab for days 3 through 5, and it's like multiple a day. There's so many. So that's part of it, is I'm like listening and like mostly looking for, to be clear, I'm not like, this sounded modern. That's not those tabs. Those tabs are like, what does this mean kind of tabs. But yeah, immersion reading for me, which is probably not standard. I feel like most people don't immersion read. And then Christy,
I feel like if you're listening to audio, it definitely is different because like Kramer's voice is so like deep and serious sounding.
That's fair.
Whereas my reading voice is like how I talk.
That's
fair. Interesting. Yeah, I think that's why anytime Lift is read from him, like if she's in a scene, it always comes across as like, what's happening? Because he has a very, traditionally deep masculine voice, and then he's giving that voice to this strange young girl, So I think that does make those moments stand out almost more. Whereas some of the other ones, I wonder if they don't as much. There are some people that can make, it's like, have you guys ever seen David Attenborough narrating the turtles in someone's backyard or whatever? So for those that don't know, although this is not anything to Sophia, certainly, because he's a national treasure, David Attenborough is a narrator of many documentary, and he's done a lot of nature documentaries. And so I think it's on the Graham Norton show. They just show him some like not great footage of a turtle, and they ask him to on the spot narrate it, and he makes it sound so sophisticated just in the fact that he's so good at it. And he can have like a little charm and a little silliness here and there, but he's just such a gifted narrator, you could say, but obviously different kind of narration, not reading aloud these epic fantasy stories. But anyway, I think that there's something there, certainly, about maybe that is contributing to part of it. But anyway, I had intended for this to be a quick little like 20-minute chat. I did not realize though that he did address that part. So thank you, Christy, for making sure that we got to that, because I think that enhanced the conversation and added to it. My main takeaway is something I kind of already mentioned. I always want authors to write the stories they want to write. And if using the word dating, is like really important. I know I'm giving such a hyper specific thing, but to speak more generally, whatever he feels is genuinely going to tell his story in the best of ways, then that's what I want him to do. And I think he would hopefully feel similarly to what I'm about to say. If that doesn't necessarily fit everybody's tastes, that is also okay. And I might be one of those people where some of his word choice, some of the shift in tone isn't going to fit my taste, but I still would rather he writes what he wants, not what I want. That's my takeaway. And also, I still love the Cosmere. I feel like it's coming across like I just don't think I can read him anymore, which isn't what I mean at all. I'm curious, is that kind of the takeaway for everybody else? Nobody's like, no, he should write what I want. I don't feel like that.
I don't think any of us, at least,
entitled. Yeah, that's the thing. Is there's a lot of entitled people out there, so I suppose that's part of it. And I'll add, there are a lot of people that think they know what would make something objectively better. And I'm just like, that's not how art works, in my opinion. That's not how art works. So you can have your personal taste, but obviously this conversation proves not even all 5 of us agree on
Right.
So it's different from person to person. Anyway, thanks so much for this little extra Stormlight Archive deep dive into the concept of criticisms. And if you have anything you want to add to the conversation, please feel free. Thanks so much to my friends for joining me. This was a very long day for everybody involved, as they were just coming off the tail end of recording for days 3 and 5. So a big thank you to all of them for spending basically 3 hours diving into Cosmere related things. But thanks so much, everybody, for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you later. Bye.